What's up, everybody? Just want to take a quick second and let people know that I am self-supported. I now put all of my episodes on Substack for paid subscribers. I put them up early, and then 24 hours later, I release them to the public on all my platforms. I also have Venmo, PayPal, Cash App, Buy Me a Coffee, Zelle, a P.O. Box, and Locals, Patreon. And all of the links are in the show notes of every single episode I put out. So look forward to continuing to provide great conversations. And thank you all for your continued support. Ron, thanks for coming on. I appreciate it. And it's been a crazy week.
Oh, sure. Great to be here.
It's I want to start off with get your thoughts on Charlie Kirk, Turning Point, and what was your initial reaction when you found out that he had been killed?
Well, to be honest, I really hadn't been very aware of him. In other words, I don't spend any time on social media, and I don't really follow the sort of mainstream conservative movement. So although I knew his name, and, I'd seen some mention of him here or there, I really had never listened to any of his podcasts. I'd never really watched any of his speeches. I'm not sure if he really did much writing, but I hadn't read anything of it. So I really was only very slightly even aware of him. And so that's why, when the report came out that he'd been shot, and, then the report came out that he'd been killed, and that provoked such an outpouring of massive media coverage, I was actually a little bit surprised about that because, again, we all live sort of in our own relatively isolated circles. And since I hadn't really paid much attention to him, the fact that, he was such a major conservative figure, and I know that he'd had a large conservative organization, Turning Point USA, but apparently it really was one of the largest grassroots conservative organizations. And so obviously, his assassination is really a very, very big event. In other words, it's probably really one of the most significant political assassinations in America in decades. At least nothing else really comes to mind in recent years. Obviously, there were those attempted assassinations of Donald Trump when he was running for his new term. But those were attempted assassinations. And I just can't think of the last time somebody who apparently was so prominent and so popular has been assassinated in that sort of way in America.
And in the manner in which it took place, right? He was in a university with, they said, over 3,000 people attending, and right on the stage, he takes the bullet to the throat. This episode is brought to you by McIlvaney Financial Group. Their advisors bring a depth of knowledge and experience that allow them to serve their clientele with care, ensuring their financial needs are met now and in the future. Personally, I'm not saying cash is worthless, but you can see what's happening. It's worth less every year. Gold is the opposite. Click on the promo link in the show notes or go to www.mcilvaney.com/coffeeandamike.
Oh, exactly. And also, for example, I found out afterwards that, he obviously received a number of death threats over the years. And so he had apparently a full security detail. He was wearing a bulletproof vest, and he was killed by a sniper who apparently fired from something like 400 feet away, or
200 yards or something they were reporting.
Exactly, long distance. So in other words, that sort of snipe killing. I can't think of the last time that's happened to a political figure in America other than in the 1960s, a half century ago, with the Martin Luther King and with obviously the most famous case of all, John F. Kennedy. Because, typically most of the assassinations or killings or attempted assassinations have involved usually somebody walking up to the person with a handgun and shooting the person. Like, for example, there were those two attacks on President Gerald Ford, Squeaky Fromm, who just sort of came up to him with a handgun and tried to shoot him, or, when that guy tried to shoot Ronald Reagan. So, that's very different than what seemed to be a much more professional killing from, with a sniper from, that sort of distance. And also, it sounded like the person must have known that Kirk was wearing a bulletproof vest because he shot him in the neck. That's not, most of these other killings, somebody just sort of takes a handgun and shoots at the person in sort of a haphazard type of way. So, I mean, we're talking about something a lot more serious than the average case. Or even take, for example, that healthcare executive who was killed a few months ago, or maybe by now it's about a year ago, by that sort of activist who, was very angry about our
Mangione.
healthcare.
Mangione.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, again, he just sort of walked up to him, I think, on the street or in his building and shot him at close range. The man had no security detail. He didn't have any bodyguards. And, that's very different than apparently Kirk had like a full security detail. And it just shows that, if somebody wants to assassinate you under those circumstances, even if you're the president of the United States, I mean, Trump had full Secret Service protection and he was almost killed. So, it's a sign of potentially a very dangerous time in American society right now that we might be heading towards. And I mean, Kirk obviously wasn't even an elected official. He was a relatively young guy with an activist organization. I can't think of anybody in 40 or 50 years who was just sort of political activist like that who's been killed in that sort of way.
Well, and I didn't realize him. I knew he was a lot younger than me. He's 31 years old.
Yeah, exactly. Very young.
And so you're somebody that's done a lot of research on JFK, on MLK, and one of the things that I'm learning as I go further, and I'm thankful for people like yourself that come on and talk to me, because this isn't linear, right? And you think it, like, there are people that are generally, they watch Fox News, they watch CNN, and they think, oh, it's this group. Oh, it's this. And it's never like that. It's much more complex even than I can imagine sometimes. When I talk to people, I'm like, oh my God, this thing is way, way deeper than even what I thought it was initially. So, with Charlie Kirk, I was talking to a friend of mine about this, and first of all, to the shooter, because they got somebody in custody this morning, and apparently the father the father had a conversation with his son. His son had admitted to him that he did it, and the father turned him in. That may be true. That might not be true. But most parents don't turn their kids in. It's very bizarre. And then the idea of the bullets having some type of trans inscripted on it, or the rifle, or now we're getting into a Harrison Ford, Jack Ryan movie, I feel like, with some of that.
Yeah, that seemed very suspicious to me. I mean, well, first of all, they did arrest two other people at the scene and then release them afterwards, saying that, they'd gotten the wrong people. So, it could be they have the person right now, or maybe we'll find out it was sort of a third mistaken, identity or something like that. But I mean, one other thing that was very strange about this particular assassination attempt is I can't remember the last time when a successful or unsuccessful assassination attempt involved the person getting away clean like that. Now, again, I guess that was the case of that healthcare executive. They only caught him like a few days later. But for example, in the case of the two assassination attempts against Trump, in the case of the assassinations of the Kennedys or Martin Luther King, I mean, they pretty much found the name of the person, or they knew who they were looking for almost immediately, or they caught him at the scene. And so it just seemed, and again, in most of these other cases where somebody just sort of walks up to an elected official and tries to shoot the person, I mean, they get the person right at the scene. So in this case, where at least initially they had no idea who had done it, I mean, that seemed, again, strange to me. And the fact, obviously, one reason the person was able to get away was that he was a sniper firing from like 400 feet away, which, is very different than somebody just walking up to an elected official with a handgun and shooting at him. So, I guess we'll sort of know better in the next day or two what really had happened. And the fact that apparently, at least according to media reports, there were sort of that evidence of, transgender sentiment or something like that on the bullets. It just seemed a very strange thing. The whole thing about it is, my sense would be that if somebody had shot Kirk for being allegedly hostile to transgenderism, I mean, the person who probably would shoot him would be sort of very emotionally deranged, very, you know, almost crazy or insane. And that seems very different than somebody firing at somebody with a sniper scope from that sort of distance. And as far as I know, I mean, there's no way you could shoot somebody from 400 feet away without a sniper scope. So, in other words, we're talking about something that seemed much closer to a professional assassination rather than these sort of random killings that, we've seen an awful lot of over the years. I mean, in fact, when you look at it, most American presidents who've died by assassination over the last 100, 150 years have typically died by somebody walking up to them with a gun and shooting them in person. I mean, the JFK case was an exception to it, but in the 19th century, when a couple of presidents were assassinated, again, it was sort of somebody just walking up to the person with a handgun and shooting them, and the person being immediately arrested afterwards. So, I mean, this seemed just a lot stranger and more surprising than your average, typical assassination attempt.
Also, with that is, the event itself and the amount of people that were there, how many phones were recording at that moment? And they're showing this person running on the roof, which I mean, you'd have to slow down for me to see it. But, then the FBI puts a picture of this potential person of interest. And I thought to myself, I'm like, these are the most powerful agencies in the world. I would think they'd be able to figure this out without having to post it publicly. You can find people. You can't hide in this country or in the world if the most powerful agencies are trying to find you, in my opinion.
Also, the other thing about it is, I think the two people they initially arrested and then released were just arrested because they were running from the scene. Now, when you have this sort of, shocking assassination, you can easily imagine lots of people running away or just sort of being terrified of what happened. So, it'll be interesting to see whether this particular person they arrested, who was seen running away, really was actually guilty, or maybe, it's another false identification. In other words, if they previously arrested two people and then had to release them, that means that it's probably a little less solid about this third person actually being the guilty culprit.
So also, with this, as I was talking to a friend of mine, and he was just suggesting things that I'm like, oh, and I started kind of doing a deeper dive because what I'm about to share with you, I have not heard out there yet. And again, you're somebody that spent a lot of time doing research on Kennedy and MLK. So I'm curious what you think, what I'm about to share with you, because you're right. Charlie Kirk was not just a content creator, right? Ben Shapiro is a content creator. Nick Fuentes is a content creator. Turning Point, Charlie Kirk and Turning Point, they were a political organization that was on the rise, that one could argue, delivered the youth, got the youth to come out and vote. Never had happened before on the Republican side. So there's a sister company called Turning Point Action, which is a grassroots organization. I don't know if you're familiar with them at all, but they're a grassroots organization that really helped get people out and get young people registered to vote and to vote. And one could argue that he delivered the youth to Trump this past election. So I think to myself, I'm like, this guy is not just a content creator. So who would benefit from him and the organization not being as effective anymore? Does that play into it? And again, this is just a theory. It very well could be leftist, some lunatic, trans, whatever, this guy that they have in custody or somebody else. But you start to wonder, man, this kid at 31 years old, look at who he was running around with. He was running around with powerful, powerful people. Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, Trump's sons. He had all the indication. I mean, he was a politician at this point, right? Not just a content creator. So who benefits from him and the organization? I mean, I don't know how the organization will move on without him. He was their leader. He was the one that connected with young people to get them out to vote. So I find it, the establishment, do they want MAGA gone? The Democrats? Is it a combination? Who benefits from him not being out there now?
Sure, sure. I mean, obviously, one possibility is if they did catch the actual gunman, we'll find out very quickly. And it could be it was just sort of a random nut or some sort of transgender activist or something like that. But otherwise, I mean, one thing I'd sort of been suspicious about was, as I said, I mean, he's been around for, I think, 12 years, 13 years now, and I'd only been very vaguely aware of him. I really not paid much attention to his organization. I'd known of him, but that's bad. It was actually just a couple of months ago that I first started, hearing more about him, and that was because Tucker Carlson had given a speech at Kirk's annual national convention. And Carlson's speech got a lot of visibility. It was right in the immediate aftermath of the Epstein case. And Carlson really gave a remarkable speech where he publicly declared that everybody in D.C. knew that Epstein was working for the Israeli government, for the Israeli Mossad, and that Epstein's operation was an Israeli operation to blackmail and control American politicians. And, that's not just some fringe activist saying it, it's Tucker Carlson saying it. I mean, the most powerful media figure in America. And saying it in front of a gigantic audience of all these thousands of people. And what surprised me when I was watching his speech at the time, what really shocked me was the thunderous applause Carlson got for those remarks, because I'd sort of always vaguely assumed that Turning Point and Kirk's organization, just like most conservative organizations, was very pro-Israel, very strongly committed to supporting Israel, everything like that. And for Tucker Carlson to declare that Epstein was working for the Israeli government to control American politicians, a very serious charge. And for him to say that everybody in D.C. knew that, but nobody was willing to dare say that in public, and to have all the supporters at that convention then clapping their hands and cheering him. I mean, that seemed to me a dramatic step forward. In fact, I wrote an article about the Epstein case at the time. And, one of the things I did was include that clip by Carlson and, sort of describe what was happening. So that was actually one of the first times I'd really been, I hadn't even known that Kirk had these national conventions once a year where, gather together all these thousands of supporters. And then apparently in the weeks afterwards, I started seeing some clips by Kirk where he made fairly similar statements to what Carlson had done. In other words, he sort of suddenly became much more critical of Israel, critical of Epstein's involvement with Mossad and everything like that. And in fact, I'm tracking down some of those clips right now because, some of them went viral on Twitter. And so it seemed to me that, Kirk might be shifting his political perspective rather dramatically in the wake of the Epstein revelations and the wake of Carlson's, dramatic speech at his organization. And also, obviously, the whole Gaza, ongoing thing with so much, such a strong shift of younger people in America away from supporting Israel. And so, that certainly would logically explain why somebody like Kirk would sort of shift in the same direction. And that's really all I knew about Kirk. In other words, I probably watched more videos of Kirk's statements in the last couple of months than I had in the previous several years combined. And then suddenly, Kirk is assassinated. And so, that raised initial suspicions in my mind. And not only that, but I mean, Kirk was killed on September 10th, one day before the September 11th anniversary. Not only that, but I'm sure you may have heard, I just found out a few days ago that Tucker Carlson had been about to release a new documentary series on the September 11th attacks. And apparently it was going to be a very controversial series. I'd seen him on the Piers Morgan show. I watched the show. In fact, I had been planning to write an article for this Monday's release on September 11th anniversary and on Tucker Carlson's video documentary. But Carlson ended up delaying his documentary because of, the Kirk killing. And so, it just seemed to me that, if somebody as prominent apparently as Kirk is assassinated one day before the September 11th anniversary, that means suddenly there's no attention given to that anniversary. It sweeps everything else away. So I really became very suspicious that, maybe the Israelis had been involved in Kirk's assassination. Because the whole thing about it is, look at, for example, someone like Candace Owens. Candace Owens had come from exactly that same background. I think she may have worked for Kirk's organization at some point, and then she worked for example, Ben Shapiro's organization. She was
at Prager University before she went to Daily Wire.
She was a young conservative activist of exactly that same type. And yet, in the last several years, she'd suddenly shifted her ground dramatically and become very hostile, very concerned about Israeli power, about Mossad. She declared that Mossad had been involved. Apparently, the Israelis had probably been involved in the September 11th attacks. And, that caused, her to receive a huge audience. For example, I think it was about 5 or 6 months ago, the Israelis had attacked the USS Liberty in 1967 and, killed or wounded 200 American servicemen. It was the worst naval attack America had suffered since the Second World War. And it was completely covered up by the American government. And so Candace Owens actually had one of the main Liberty survivors on her show. And she probably got more attention for the Israeli attack on the USS Liberty than had been gotten by all the other events and documentaries in the 50 or 60 years since that attack, because she's a high profile media figure. So, it seemed to me that if it seemed that someone like Charlie Kirk, who, is a much more prominent figure than Candace Owens had been when she was a conservative, if he seemed to be shifting in the same direction, moving in the same direction as Candace Owens had moved, that would cause tremendous concern in certain quarters because, Kirk had such a strong following among young Americans. And, the fact that basically Tucker Carlson had given that speech at his organization, we're talking about something that could have a huge ideological impact on American society. So, that was, my original suspicion. And, it could be that they found it was just a transgender activist. But, one thing that also made me suspicious is when the shooter got away, but it left behind clear evidence that he was an anti-Fa activist or transgender activist. That seemed very reminiscent of, when the planes hit the World Trade Center. There was a huge fireball, and allegedly they generated such a gigantic explosion they knocked down the World Trade Center, those two World Trade Center buildings, and even caused Building 7 to collapse. Yet one of the passports of a hijacker allegedly was thrown free of the explosions on the planes, so that it fell to the ground and was picked up by an ordinary, public spirited citizen. So that's just a ridiculous story that is one of the key things about September 11th that is absurd. In the same way, for example, one of the hijackers had allegedly lost his luggage on his way to the hijacking, and the luggage was found to be filled with all sorts of Islamicist manifestos and his plans to attack the World Trade Center. So in the same way, if the shooter got away clean, but left behind all of this evidence that he was a crazed leftist, anti-Fa, transgender activist, that's the sort of thing that would make me very suspicious. Maybe they've caught the guy, maybe we'll find out it was exactly what it seemed to be. But when I think of anti-Fa activists, I think of those three people who were shot by Rittenhouse at that riot. In other words, they were so incompetent that that one young teenager shot all three of them, even though they had weapons. And, he was just a young guy. So, again, that's the sort of precision of anti-Fa activists I think of, not somebody who can, commit a political assassination using scoped rifle from 400 feet away. So, I just, the whole thing just seemed very suspicious to me at the time. Now, again, suspicions are difficult than hard evidence. And if it turns out he, is exactly what the initial suspicions were, then, I'll certainly admit that my suspicions were wrong. But at least at the time, that's the first thing that came to my mind. That, the first time I'd really heard anything about Charlie Kirk or paid any attention to him had been the 2 months before his killing, when he'd started producing video statements that were suddenly very critical and suspicious of Israel, following Tucker Carlson's statements along similar lines. And, when you have never heard of somebody who's a major political activist, and suddenly you hear that he's very critical of Israel, and he gets shot in a professional assassination on September 10th, you suddenly start to wonder a lot of things.
Well, and the differences between him and Candace Owens and Nick Fuentes, Nick Fuentes, he's credited your work many, many times. And he was out very early about this. But those are content creators versus Charlie Kirk is not only a content creator, but they are a political organization. And by all intents purposes, he's a politician.
Exactly, exactly. I mean, in other words, it's very different for somebody just to sort of produce videos and have people watch them to be, as you say, a content creator, and for somebody to have the largest conservative grassroots organization in America. Also, I mean, I'd never really watched Kirk or listened to his podcast, but with some of the stuff coming up, I've watched a few clips from him, and he really seemed like a very well-spoken sort of person, very solid. I mean, not at all sort of somebody who came across as sort of a fringe figure. And also, I mean, in the case of Candace Owens, some of her public statements have really been sort of outrageous. Like, for example, she's had a whole series promoting the idea that the president of France is married to his own father. And, I mean, something like that is sort of ridiculous. And, when you say a lot of ridiculous things that seem to have very little basis for it, it helps to then weaken your credibility on issues like the USS Liberty or some of these other things. Well, as far as I know, again, I don't know exactly all the things that Charlie Kirk had said over the years. They seem to be, very sort of mainstream conservative, following the sort of things that mainstream conservatives these days preach. But I didn't get the sense that any of his statements were sort of so outlandish or self-discrediting that it would really have affected his, position. So, for example, if he ended up coming out, take, for example, take Tucker Carlson's new series on September 11th. I mean, in fact, I'd been thinking a week or two ago about writing an article, on the anniversary of September 11th and saying how it had now been totally forgotten by the American media. It had dropped off the radar screen. After 24 years, nobody remembered it or cared about it anymore. And then suddenly, just a few days ago, I discovered that Tucker Carlson, probably the most prominent media figure in America, had just produced a multi-part series on September 11th, declaring that the official story was an utter lie. And when I saw him on Piers Morgan, I thought he did a very convincing, solid job. And if his documentary were nearly as strong, he single-handedly could reopen the whole case. And, if you imagine, apparently he's quite friendly with Charlie Kirk. If you can imagine then Kirk endorsing Tucker Carlson's conclusions to his large political organization, that could have a tremendous amount of political impact. For example, it was only a couple of years ago that Tucker Carlson when he was still on Fox News, Carlson who did a segment, a 20 or 25-minute segment, saying that he was convinced that JFK had died in a conspiracy and he thought the CIA was involved. In other words, and I remember at the time, for example, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. tweeted out a statement that Carlson's segment was the single most courageous television segment anyone had done in 60 years. And I think probably more people became aware of the JFK case because of Tucker Carlson's segment on Fox News and, the YouTube video of it than had been the case in the 30 years since Oliver Stone's movie left the theaters. And so just like Tucker Carlson played a very important role in reviving the JFK case after more than 60 years, his new series about the September 11th attacks, which, I haven't seen yet and probably will be released within the next few days or a week once, the Charlie Kirk business has sort of died down. I mean, that could have a tremendous impact on American public opinion. In fact, I was just thinking to myself that I really think Carlson should be careful not doing public events, not going, in situations where he might be vulnerable to, a deadly attack, because, I mean, that's the sort of thing that, could really make a difference in American society. So, again, if Carlson can revive the whole issue of September 11th right now, after 24 years, I mean, that could have a very important impact on, everything we know. I mean, just like, for example, it was just a few months ago that that all the remaining files on the JFK assassination were finally declassified. And as far as I can tell, almost nothing new was released. In other words, there was evidence that came out that had been held back for 60 years that, for example, James Angleton, who'd been the head of counterintelligence at the CIA, had had a very close relationship with the Israeli Mossad, had really been, extremely close to the Israeli Mossad. And that was about the only new revelation that seemed to come out. But wasn't much of a revelation because everybody had known that for 30 or 40 years. For example, the Washington Post had published an article declaring that fact 37 years ago. Seymour Hersh had published it in one of his bestsellers. Many other people had said the same thing. So, in other words, when documents are released confirming what everybody had known for 20 or 30 or 35 years, that's not a dramatic revelation, but it's still tremendously revived the whole JFK issue. And, I wrote about it, lots of other people wrote about it. And, suddenly the JFK issue became much more real to people in the way, had not been the case prior to the documents being released. So I think there's a perfect chance that Tucker Carlson's multi-part documentary may do the same thing for September 11th that he was able to do for the JFK assassination. And, it could be that Charlie Kirk would have given a lot of support to Tucker Carlson's efforts in that regard, given that, they were friends with each other. So, I mean, those are the sorts of things that went through my mind when I heard that he'd been killed in what seemed to be a very professional assassination. And, maybe it was a professional assassination, maybe it was just a random nut. But, it seemed much closer to being a professional assassination than any of the recent assassination attempts I can think of in American society over the last 20 or 30 years. I mean, remember, for example, when that crazy left-winger just walked up to a group of Republican congressmen and tried to shoot them with his assault rifle? I mean, that's typically the sort of killings we have. He just took out his gun and blazed away at them. And I mean, they had no security protection. None of them were armed. He was just some sort of random nut with an assault rifle. And I mean, that's the sort of thing we typically see, rather than somebody shooting somebody surrounded by professional security detail who was wearing a bulletproof vest, who'd been taking precautions against exactly this sort of potential assassination attempt. So, it just, is the sort of thing that I think would make a lot of people, prominent people, very nervous in American society.
Well, also in the manner of which he was killed, because, and I didn't look this up before we started talking, but Breitbart didn't he supposedly die of a heart attack in his sleep?
Well, yeah, I think so. And I mean, again, there are all these sort of suspicions floating around and, sort of conspiracy theories or suspicions or beliefs. And I mean, I have no, in other words, in the case of someone like Breitbart, maybe the circumstances of the death were a little bit suspicious, but from what I remember, he was extremely overweight and had health problems. So, when somebody's extremely overweight and have health problems, dies in his sleep, and I really never paid any attention to Breitbart, so I wasn't even, at the time he died. And also his organization was much smaller. It was just sort of a website at the time. So, at the time of his death, I sort of heard that he died at a relatively young age. I don't even remember how old he was at the time. And I thought, oh, that's sort of interesting. And then I remember a few conservatives were saying they were very suspicious of his death. And I thought, well, maybe something happened to him. But I mean, there's a great deal of difference between somebody who has health problems dying apparently of natural causes that way and somebody wearing a bulletproof vest, leader of the largest conservative organization in America, who seemed very well spoken, very charismatic, and had a full security detail, being killed in what seems to be, the closest thing to a very professional assassination we've seen. I mean, I can't even remember the last time when anybody in America has been killed in an assassination that seemed that professional. I mean, there were those two snipers who tried to shoot Trump, but I mean, neither of them seemed very professional at all. I mean, that first guy apparently was walking around with his rifle, and he sort of just walked around, and none of the Secret Servicemen did anything about him, even though he was carrying his rifle in plain sight. I mean, that's not a very professional assassination. And, most of these other killings are just sort of the sort of thing somebody takes a gun and shoots at somebody. I honestly can't remember the last time we've had a sniper who was positioned in, an ideal location and killed somebody wearing a bulletproof vest surrounded by security detail. I mean, that's the sort of thing you see in third world countries where somebody at the military or the intelligence services decides to assassinate somebody. I mean, that's not the typical thing we've had in American society. And that's why when the guy then escaped, that made me more and more suspicious about the circumstances.
Also on a public stage, right? Where you know that that video is going to be not only recorded from all these different angles, but it's going to be in today's world with social media shared with billions of people viewing it. What was that message being sent? Having it done on a stage in public, knowing the ability to share it all over the world. What kind of message were they sending to anybody, any adversary, any other organization that would, attempt to step in, because people are, there are media people that are going to benefit from this. Viewership's going to shift. I mean, Nick Fuentes last night, I looked at his video, his first live stream since he passed. He had 170,000 people watching live on Rumble, and you and I talked offline what our thoughts are on Rumble. He had almost 1.5 million people watch his video from last night.
Oh, that's amazing. And exactly. The other, when I was thinking a little bit about it, and again, I'm not an expert on the history of assassinations, the fact that this assassination was videoed live when it happened, the closest example I can think of is the JFK assassination 62 years ago. I mean, for example, when Martin Luther King was killed by a sniper, there was no video involved. When Robert F. Kennedy was killed, it was videoed, but it was somebody just walking up and, shooting at him. So, I mean, he wasn't videoed while he was being shot. I honestly can't think of the last time we've had an American political assassination or assassination of any type that was captured on screen and broadcast. And, even the case of the JFK assassination, the famous videotape that somebody made of it at the time, accidentally, that was only released, I think, 20 or 30 years later. So nobody at the time had access to the video. Might be the first videoed assassination of a prominent figure in modern American history. I can't think of any other example of that. So, I mean, we're talking about something, there's also, if it's a random nut, then it's a random nut. But if it turns out not to be a random nut, or people are suspicious of the random nut story, I mean, what you're doing by this sort of public assassination is sending if it is an organization that was involved rather than just a random nut, you're sending a very powerful warning message to every prominent person in American society. In other words, when you think of, for example, American billionaires or prominent American politicians, U.S. senators or Supreme Court justices, most of them do not walk around on a daily basis with the sort of security detail that Charlie Kirk had. They don't wear bulletproof vests on a daily basis. I mean, for example, the president of that healthcare organization who was shot by that random, activist. I mean, he had no bodyguards. He had no bulletproof vest. He was just sort of walking on his way to work. And so, probably 99.9% of wealthy, powerful, prominent people in America, Hollywood stars, top elected officials, billionaires or multi-billionaires, don't have anything like the security that Charlie Kirk had, and he was still killed. So, if he was killed by an organization rather than a random nut, I mean, that's a very, very powerful message to send to all of the wealthy, powerful, influential people in American society. If you're a content creator and spend your time at home doing videos, you're relatively safe. But if you're somebody who goes out on a daily basis, who speaks before audiences, who's an elected official, holds public meetings, who's a corporate executive who goes to your office every day, I mean, you're much, much more vulnerable, I think, than someone like Charlie Kirk is. And if he can be killed, you can be killed. And that's a very dangerous message to send to people.
Well, and also, like I'd mentioned earlier, and you brought up a good point. I didn't even know about the series that Tucker was scheduled to release on 9/11, but
I just heard about it a couple of days ago.
Well, and there's layers to all this, right? Where so many people think that it's black and white, and this is good guys versus bad guys, and superhero movie, and Jack Ryan and so on and so forth. But to your point, where you talk about Israel, Mossad, and also what I mentioned earlier, there's Democrats, establishment Republicans. They don't want Trump. They want him to lose the House and the Senate next year. Charlie Kirk. I didn't agree with everything he said, and I didn't agree with everything with Turning Point. He did an amazing job getting out to the youth. I mean, I'm seeing it just a response from the youth since his passing. I mean, it's unbelievable. There's nobody to step in and carry that torch. So next year into the midterms, I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm way wrong, but I don't know how they're going to carry on and be as effective as they were last year. So maybe there's a combination of things, of people and parties and deep state, because the deep state is not it's not left right, that benefits from not only from him not being alive anymore, and the organization now being neutralized.
Sure. I mean, there are all sorts of possibilities. Another example, there was that really horrifying killing of that young Ukrainian woman. You probably saw it. I didn't see the video, but I mean, I saw sort of
Oh,
like, sort of a lot of talk of it. That, a very attractive young Ukrainian woman who was killed by that lunatic black guy on some sort of, I think, light rail train
in
in
Charlotte,
Charlotte.
23-year-old girl.
Exactly. And, I mean, that got huge attention and generated tremendous attention. And so, for example, my website attracts all sorts of conspiratorially minded people, with some of their conspiracies more plausible than others. And they were saying that maybe Charlie Kirk was killed to distract attention from that other clip, which was getting so much attention. They were saying that, for example, the fact that, crime was so out of control that, somebody would be killed in that way, could help ensure that the Republicans won the midterm elections. So maybe, for example, this other killing took place partly to deflect attention from that, or, for example, to deflect attention. I mean, there's so many possibilities. And I mean, the one thing, again, that made me suspicious at the time is I'd heard about Tucker Carlson's video series. And then a day or so later, I found out that he'd been on the Piers Morgan show. And I watched it. It seemed like he did a very good job, and he was about to release this full series on 9/11, blowing the case wide open. And then suddenly, on September 10th, one day before the series is about to release, Charlie Kirk is assassinated. And so, again, there are all sorts of coincidences, possibilities, different sort of elements that might be involved. But, I mean, if they did catch the guy, in other words, if he really was the shooter rather than, the third mistaken identity person they found. I mean, we'll soon probably find out what happened. And, maybe he was an Antifa activist who just was much better organized than most of the Antifa activists and, committed a, very serious sort of political assassination. I mean, the whole thing about it is when I think of these transgender activists or Antifa people, I think of all those like Black Lives Matter rioters. I mean, they were all sort of rioting, burning down buildings, protesting. I mean, can you imagine any of them committing a serious political assassination? No, I mean, in fact, if the government had stood up to them, they all probably would have run away. And for example, the three of them who were shot by Rittenhouse when they were attacking him and trying to burn down the building. I mean, most of them, they were sort of like drug addicts or very marginal people who'd apparently been hired by like some of these leftist organizations to riot. I mean, they were the sort of people who you could imagine throwing bricks through building windows, through glass windows, rather than shooting somebody with a sniper scope from 200 feet away. I mean, this is really one of the most professional political assassinations I think American society has seen in decades, maybe since, the JFK assassination. And it just, initially, it's difficult for me to believe it was committed by some young guy, over transgenderism. Also, as far as I could tell, Charlie Kirk supported transgenderism, which was one of the strange things. In other words, one of the people who we republish on our website is Andrew Anglin, the sort of internet provocateur who loves taking a contrarian view. And he published a couple of articles very sharply critical of Charlie Kirk, sort of denouncing him and everything like that. And in one of them, for example, he had a clip of Charlie Kirk in which Kirk, for example, ridiculed the American academic establishment for claiming that there were 47 separate genders. And he said, on the other hand, if a man wants to say he's a woman or a woman wants to say he's a man, that's perfectly fine. But there are only two genders rather than 47 genders. So, at least based on that one clip I saw, it sounded like Charlie Kirk did really support transgenderism. So it's not clear to me why, if he was a supporter of transgenderism, why a transgender activist would want to assassinate him. I mean, again, transgender activists are probably crazy, so that, crazy people do crazy things for all sorts of different reasons. But it's not like Charlie Kirk was sort of some religious fanatic who is strongly opposed to transgenderism. I also saw a photograph. Trump had been a supporter of transgenderism. And apparently one of the prominent Trump supporters was some crazy activist called Lady
MAGA.
Maga,
Yeah.
some man dressed up as a woman. And in fact, one of the photographs I saw was Charlie Kirk sort of standing next to Lady Maga, sort of shaking hands with her, sort of having a friendly photograph with her. So, why in the world would a transgender activist hate Charlie Kirk so much that he wanted to kill him? It just doesn't seem to make a lot of sense.
The whole story to me, as it's unfolding, is getting more bizarre, just like Butler, more bizarre, more bizarre. And then I asked the question: we might never know. To your point with JFK, I mean, how many years later, and we still don't know everything. But I also, and this ties into your article that you wrote on Monday. Is Trump the President Donald Trump is funding as founding father of the newer world order? Sorry for butchering that.
Sure.
And my thought with that is, after 9/11, government always takes advantage of a crisis. So, obviously when you published it, these events had not occurred. And I'm seeing, anybody that's criticizing, Kirk's death or making a mockery of it, teachers are getting fired. And it's horrible that people are celebrating it, but government always takes advantage of things. So, and people are cheering. I mean, I ran into two people yesterday. They were like, they need to go in, the National Guard, Trump needs to go in all these cities and clean it out, and iron fist. And I'm like, be careful what you wish for with all this, because the government, once they have power, they don't give it back.
Yeah, I mean, one of the points I made is, that Trump's, for example, tariff policies are just totally nuts, and that, tariffs are import taxes. A tariff is just another name for an import tax. For all of American history, and in the Constitution, says taxes can only be imposed by a vote of Congress. In other words, Congress has the right of taxation. And Trump has simply declared that because of a national emergency, he has the right to impose any tax rates he wants on imports around the country, which is just totally nuts. And, suddenly, for example, he imposed a 50% tariff tax on all Indian products. And the Indians were so outraged that even though, for example, India had been quite friendly with the United States, supportive of the United States, that he ended up, that basically the Indians completely shifted to the other direction and are now, ended up meeting with the Chinese, meeting with the Russians, and becoming much more allied with the BRICS group, being hostile to America. I mean, India has sort of been trying to take a middle ground, but I mean, being attacked in that sort of ferocious way by Donald Trump and also insulted. I mean, the Indian government is sort of an ultra-nationalist, very, extreme sort of pro-Indian government. And for Trump and his people to insult them in that sort of way and slap a 50% tariff tax on them is just utterly outrageous. I mean, in fact, what Trump in effect doing is pushing all of the major countries in the world to form an anti-American alliance. I mean, Trump, in effect, what I said in my article, is the founder of the newer world order. I mean, with China and Russia, now with India, he did the same thing with Brazil. In other words, the former president of Brazil had apparently tried to stage a coup and stay in power. Trump liked him. And so Trump said it was outrageous for the Brazilians to prosecute him. And Trump imposed a 50% tariff on Brazil. In other words, I have no idea whether the guy really tried to stage a coup or not. But when somebody is prosecuted by when a Brazilian leader is prosecuted in Brazilian courts by Brazilian prosecutors before Brazilian judges, it's none of America's business. And for Trump to suddenly declare that he's the emperor of the world and will impose a 50% tariff, a gigantic tariff against Brazil, because basically they're prosecuting somebody he likes. I mean, that's absurd. I mean, the ironic thing about it is The Economist, for example, had shown that, I mean, right now, for example, Trump's target all along has been China, you know, Chinese imports. Right now, our tariff rate against Chinese imports is 10%, while it's 50% against Brazil and against India. It's much higher against those countries. And so what he's doing is pushing all those countries, all those major countries in the world, into an anti-American alliance, which is incredibly counterproductive to American interests. The other thing about it is Trump has declared, and his people are right now appealing to the Supreme Court, that the President of the United States, by declaring that there's a national emergency, has the power to impose tax rates, tariff taxes, at any level against any party he wants. Now, suppose, for example, the next president or the next president after that is a liberal Democrat. Trump is setting the precedent that any Democratic president can impose any tax rate by the power of fiat for any reason in American society. For example, if a liberal Democrat, if Bernie Sanders or any leftist were elected president after Trump, that person could say, we have a national emergency of corporations downsizing. Therefore, I'm going to impose a 50% income tax rate against any corporation that lays people off, which will force them to avoid any corporate layoffs. So, for example, he could say, I think it's wrong for corporations not to raise their wages. For example, they should all have a minimum wage of $30 an hour. Any corporation that refuses to pay all their workers a minimum of $30 an hour will suddenly get a 50% tax rate imposed. I mean, he could do that. I mean, that's exactly what Trump has been doing on the international level. And if Trump wins this vote in the Supreme Court, I can't see any reason why any Democrat wouldn't have that power in the future. I mean, it's completely irrational. So, I mean, we're talking about, I mean, one reason I don't think that's all that serious a situation for the future is given the way American society is heading right now and I was saying that even before Charlie Kirk's assassination, there seems such a possibility of dramatic political events happening in American society. I mean, the sort of dramatic political events that only come every several generations, that these issues about the right of the president to impose taxes of any type he wants on anybody he wants, I think might be swept away in broader events. I mean, we're talking about very strange things happening in American society and also on the international level. I mean, I just, it's just a very strange time. And, with arguably the highest, in fact, that's an interesting question. Offhand, can you think of the highest profile political assassination we've had prior to that of Charlie Kirk? I mean, nothing comes to mind.
And Breitbart was not nearly that level.
Well, he died in his sleep. I mean,
Yeah.
maybe he was killed, maybe he wasn't killed, but it wasn't a political assassination.
I mean, the only person this is. I mean, I was 2 years old, 3 years old. John Lennon.
Oh yeah, exactly. So we're talking about basically something 50 or 60 years ago. We're talking about nothing like this happened in modern times. I mean, back in the 60s and 70s, we had a wave of political assassination. And in fact, a couple of people even there was that guy, Hinckley, who took a shot at Ronald Reagan. But since the attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan, we've had almost no political assassinations in our country. And now suddenly, we may have a new wave of them. And I think American society is much more fragile today than it was in the 1960s or 1970s or 1980s. And a fragile society can suffer tremendous unrest, if we have this sort of thing happen.
Well, and also, to your point, when you look at Charlie Kirk, you look at the young girl, which that video got out. She was murdered a few weeks ago. And I also bring up the idea of Florida now, is deciding they're not going to do vaccine mandates anymore. They've decided as a state they're not going to require that. which to me is another signal of a state breaking away and going their own direction. So, what do you? I think this now, especially after Charlie Kirk, we're going to become much more radicalized. Where people are going to, if they didn't realize it before, maybe they're coming to the conclusion now, you can't vote your way out of this anymore. That's not going to solve it. Not that there's any simple solution, but the vote is not going to fix it.
I mean, people on fringe circles have been saying that for years. I mean, exactly that phrase, we can't vote ourselves out of this dilemma. You find it in all these comment threads, including comment threads on our website, all these anonymous radical people saying things like that for years. But what really was shocking is Tucker Carlson publicly came very close to saying that just a few days ago. In other words, I think it must have been the day before the assassination of Charlie Kirk. I was watching him, or in fact, maybe it was even that morning, that same day. I was watching Tucker Carlson being interviewed for an hour on the Piers Morgan show about his forthcoming, series on the JFK assassination. And Carlson came very close to saying that we're almost reaching the point where the democratic system cannot be used to change our government. I mean, he basically was saying that, either we have a dramatic change through the democratic system, through our voting system, or if not, he could see things taking a very, very dark direction in our society. I mean, Tucker Carlson is probably the most prominent media figure in America right now. I mean, again, he interviewed Vladimir Putin. I mean, again, every other media figure in America probably would have given his eye teeth to have a long interview with the president of Russia. Tucker Carlson got it. I mean, Tucker Carlson, his videos get millions upon millions of views. I mean, Jeffrey Sachs has been on there, John Mearsheimer, very, very prominent, respectable people have been on his show. And, I regularly watch him. And for him to say something as dramatic, he's about to release a series on on the lies behind the 9/11 attacks, how it was a lie. The story we've been told is a lie from beginning to end, a multi-part series. He's interviewed by Piers Morgan, and he basically comes very close to American society, to declaring that American society is on the verge of reaching the point of being a revolutionary situation. I mean, that's a very strong statement for someone like Carlson to make publicly. And later that day, I found out that Charlie Kirk had been assassinated. So, I mean, we're talking about all of these things coming together to, make this potentially a very, very dangerous time for our society.
I know I'm running out of time here with you, but one last thing I want to ask, as you said, you've pointed out, people come to your website with these fringe ideologies. Where does your take on all this? I mean, you hear a lot of different things, both sides of it. Where do you see things? Where do you see things going from this moment on?
I think we're in a very dangerous situation. I mean, right now, I think we're in a stock market bubble right now. I mean, again, when you look at hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars being constantly invested on AI systems, money losing AI systems. I mean, for example, they just came out with the fact that, the number of jobs created in the last 12 months was a million lower than they previously thought. So I think we're in a very stressful economic time, and we're, I think, in a stock market bubble. I mean, we're right now in a proxy war with nuclear armed Russia on Russia's own border. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if NATO ends up collapsing. I mean, for example, the same day that Kirk was assassinated, some of the split screens were showing huge riots on the street of Paris. I mean, the government of France fell again. I mean, all of these European leaders are hanging on with their fingernails. And then you have, for example, China, Russia, Brazil, India, and so many of these other countries getting together in an anti-American economic alliance. I mean, it's a very, very stressful time for American society. And I think we could see, extremely troubled times ahead. And that's especially true if it does turn out that Kirk was not killed by just a random nut, but was actually, killed maybe by some sort of organization, whether, left wing, right wing, foreign, domestic, who knows? I mean, organized killings of that sort have not been the case in American society for many, many decades. And if somebody with a security detail wearing a bulletproof vest who is taking every precaution can be killed by a sniper firing from 200 feet or 400 feet, I mean, an awful lot of other prominent people in American society are far more vulnerable than that. And it would make them very concerned, I think.
And just to add one more thing, I mean, Israel and Qatar also this week.
Exactly, exactly. I mean, Israel basically bombed America's strongest ally in the Middle East. I mean, America's largest air base is in Qatar. It's been in Qatar for decades. And the fact that we, for example, we claim to protect, we have our air base there to allegedly protect these Middle Eastern countries from attack. Our largest air base is in Qatar. And the Israelis bombed it with our collusion. In other words, we must have let them through because we have all these air defenses. I mean, for Israel to bomb the country hosting our largest Middle East air base is just an outrageous action. And it shows exactly who controls American society. For example, right after it happened, I was watching, Jeffrey Sachs, John Mearsheimer, Ray McGovern, Douglas McGregor, and all of them agreed. They weren't sure, for example, whether President Trump had been told about the attack in advance. He apparently said he hadn't been. Maybe he had been, maybe he hadn't been. But they were all 100% sure that the American security apparatus, the American military, the American CIA had been told, because they would have had to let the Israeli planes through. They allowed the Israeli planes to bomb Qatar's capital city. So, I mean, the fact that, for example, we have a situation where the American military was aware of an attack about to take place on the capital city of the country hosting America's largest military base in the region. And apparently Trump claimed that they hadn't told him about it. I mean, that's a very shocking statement. Maybe Trump wasn't telling the truth, which would be horrifying to have the president lie to the American people like that. But even more horrifying would be if the American military and the CIA hadn't bothered telling Trump what was about to happen.
What do you think all right, I lied. You got time for one more question?
Oh, sure, one more.
What do you think then the future? Well, let me back up since it's my last question. Are you surprised that the Palestinians that Israel has not been able to take over Gaza?
Well, I mean, they've been trying to drive them out. The Palestinians just refuse to leave. So, I mean, Israel has been massacring them in huge numbers. And, I mean, that's clearly has had tremendous effect on the opinion of younger Americans, have turned very hostile towards Israel, including even conservative younger Americans, because of all these horrible massacres they're seeing on their smartphones and social media. I mean, for example, just the other day, there was the case of, for example, an Israeli sniper who killed some young Palestinian deliberately, shot him dead even though he was totally unarmed. And then when his father came to retrieve his body, the sniper killed the father as well, and boasted about it apparently on social media. So I mean these things, and that's actually the reason I was suspicious about who killed Charlie Kirk, because the people in Kirk's conservative organization, younger people like that, had always been very pro-Israel. They'd been trained to be pro-Israel, indoctrinated to be pro-Israel. Their families were pro-Israel. They'd grown up pro-Israel. But in the last couple of years, according to public opinion polls, they've shifted towards much more hostility towards Israel. Suddenly, Tucker Carlson gives a major speech at Kirk's organization, declaring that the Israelis, everybody knows the Israelis were the ones behind Jeffrey Epstein. They were using him to blackmail the American government and American political figures. And he gets thunder's applause from all of these young Charlie Kirk supporters, Trump supporters. And then Kirk himself starts to make remarks that are much more skeptical or even hostile towards Israel than he's ever said before. And that's, I mean, that's the first time I sort of really paid any attention to Kirk, because I was surprised that Kirk had started to turn hostile to Israel. And then suddenly Kirk is assassinated in this sort of way. So, it certainly raised suspicions in my mind. And, we'll see. Maybe they found the guy. Maybe he's a transgender activist who was angry at Kirk for some reason. But, it's just the sort of thing that, would certainly make a lot of people, very concerned about the direction American society is heading. And I certainly hope that Carlson himself, is very careful to avoid going in public and speaking before large audiences, given the fact that he's about to release this potentially very important 9/11 documentary.
Where can people find you, Ron?
Oh, it's uns.com, the Uns Review. And again, we host all of these different people. I mean, probably most of the people we publish were and most of the commenters on our website are very supportive of Kirk and very shocked and horrified by his killing. And, I was surprised that, for example, Andrew Anglin, partly because he's such a contrarian person, denounced Kirk, was very hostile to Kirk, and, was sort of one of the voices on the other side, even though Anglin himself was sort of one of the original alt-right people, very, very right-wing. In fact, he was sort of attacking Kirk from the right, saying that Kirk was sort of a sellout or, sort of a MAGA, leftist for supporting transgender rights and that sort of thing. So, I don't really know that much about Kirk. In fact, I'm right now investigating his background a little bit more since I'm probably going to try to write an article about him for Monday. But, if you go to our website, you can certainly find a very wide range of views on all of these issues. And on Monday, I'll probably be releasing a short article with my take on the Kirk assassination.
Ron, as always, thanks for doing this. I look forward to continuing to read your work and more conversations ahead.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Mic drop.